Hello and welcome to today's IWC's Urgent Communications webinar, The Evolving World of Command and Control. Today's session is sponsored by our good friends at Avtec. My name is Donnie Jackson, editor of IWC's Urgent Communications, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about our webinar interface. If at any time you experience audio difficulties or advancing of the slides, simply press your F5 key to refresh your webinar console. That usually will fix the problem. Now, you will notice a toolbar at the bottom of your console. These buttons allow you to open and close widgets on your screen. For example, if you would like to download a PDF version of today's presentation, click on the Download Slides widget at the bottom of your screen. When you're done, click on the widget again to hide the window. Feel free to customize your webcast console. You can move windows around by dragging on the title bar, or you can resize windows by clicking on the lower right corner of any window and adjusting it to fit your needs. We invite you to get social. If at any time during our session today you hear something interesting, feel free to tweet it to your followers. Finally, I want to encourage everyone to ask questions of our experts today. As a question occurs to you, simply type it into the box at the bottom of your screen. We will be addressing as many of your questions as we can. Now I'd like to introduce today's panel, which features a bunch of guys who know what they're talking about in this area. Brett Kilborn, Vice President of Government Affairs and Deputy General Counsel for Utilities Telecom Council, or UTC. Kevin Sumrall, Vice President of Utilities and Large Public Safety at Avtec. Dave Logue, Vice President of Security and Surveillance for the Cosmopolitan of Las Vegas, and Walt Magnuson, Director at Texas A&M University of the Internet 2 Technology Evaluation Center. It's a great group, and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot. So with that, let's begin. And before we take a deep dive into technology aspects of command and control, Brett, tell us a little bit about some of the rules of the road that are helping drive a lot of the technology decisions in this area.
Thanks, Johnny. Yeah, I wanted to bring one issue to light during this call, and that is the issue of the impact of the IP transition on utility companies. So if you're looking at the slide that headed issues for utilities, there are basically three main categories of issues that are associated with the IP transition. First and foremost is functionality. So as the carriers transition off of their analog legacy systems and onto IP-based fiber services, the new services that they offer may not necessarily be able to meet all the utility requirements, specifically for latency and reliability. Utilities rely on these leaf circuits for SCADA and teleprotection. Some of these applications require extremely low latencies of, say, 40 milliseconds or less. And furthermore, they absolutely have to be 5 nines reliable. So having any kind of compromises is not an option for utilities when it comes to functionality. So that's the first and main issue. And then second issue is timing. So you've got literally hundreds, if not thousands, of circuits in some cases that utility companies are leasing from the carriers, and trying to find adequate substitute solutions for those existing circuits could be a problem, especially when you factor in how many different circuits you're talking about. So there's a timing issue associated with that. And then, part and parcel of that is sometimes you have, circuits that are actually extended for miles across different states. And as a consequence of that, a lot of times you have multiple carriers that are actually supporting a single circuit. The problem you have as a utility is that different carriers are transitioning at different times. There's no coordination at present between the carriers. There's just general requirements in terms of how much notice they have to give, but generally speaking, they don't have to coordinate between each other in terms of when they transition off different circuits, which can really create some issues for the utility companies. And then last is cost. And a couple of issues there. One, to the extent the utility companies are continuing to use these analog leased lines, they're seeing increased costs as the carriers are basically trying to wean them off of those, and the cost of supporting those circuits is going up. So we're seeing some pretty significant increases there. And then secondly, like I said before, since we're talking about hundreds if not thousands of circuits, the aggregated cost of those increases can be really high. One of the things that's taking place at the same time that we're seeing costs on the analog side, the substitute services sometimes are actually more expensive than what the existing services were. So a lot of times what you'll find is, the carriers will offer an IP line that will actually have a lot more capacity than what the previous line was providing, which is good in terms of supporting the functionality, but it may be, buckets more capacity than what we actually need, and you pay a premium for that. So that's, the main issues associated for utilities with the IP transition. Now, why is this relevant to an IWCE conference? Well, I said that, the utilities are scrambling to try and meet the deadline. In a lot of cases, they're not going to be able to do that by pulling their own fiber or getting a substitute service from the carriers, in which case wireless is probably going to be the solution of choice, at least in the near term, to try and maintain connectivity to all these hundreds of substations that are at risk of actually losing connectivity. So, unlicensed solutions like 5.8 gigahertz, for example, seem to be one of the solutions that utility companies are using. Licensed is also an option as well, although there's a little bit more of a regulatory hurdle associated with that. I guess the last thing to sort of emphasize here, the Commission is looking at this from a regulatory standpoint, and while they have provided some deadline, minimum timelines before the carriers can actually transition off these existing lines, the amount of time that the FCC has provided isn't enough. Like usually the utility companies are going to need about a year to be able to sufficiently plan ahead, especially when we're talking about all the sheer number of substations that are at risk here. So that's one issue that we've got with the FCC is we need more time. The second issue, as I mentioned before, is because there's no coordination, we're really looking for the FCC to try and step in here and provide some kind of informal coordination of how these different carriers are transitioning, particularly when it comes to the impact that it's going to have on utilities. I mean, they're unique in that respect. There are other critical infrastructure entities that are out there, pipeline companies as well, that are also at risk, but compared to residential customers and your general business enterprise customers, the IP transaction has a unique impact on the utilities, which really justifies the Commission stepping in here and trying to at least coordinate the transition as it impacts.
Yeah, okay. Very cool. Well, yeah, good information, Brett. So now you mentioned the utilities. What are some of the other industries that are also being impacted? I think I was hearing security and alarm.
Yep. So yeah, the alarm industry is heavily involved in this proceeding at the FCC that I mentioned. The petroleum industry also relies on carrier circuits as well. Pretty much anything that you can think of, where there's infrastructure located in remote areas, you're going to find that they're particularly heavily impacted by what's going on. And when I say remote, I'm talking about the fact that, that not only are the carriers basically transitioning from copper to IP, but they're also discontinuing services out in some of these rural areas. So the combination of those two trends is having a unique impact on the utilities and also other critical infrastructure entities that are actually out in those remote areas.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think aren't a lot of street lights timed and things like that based off of the analog infrastructure?
I believe so.
I
Can't
know a lot
speak
of
to
them
that directly because
transition.
can't speak to that one directly. And then the question also would be, to what extent the substitute services are adequate to be able to support street lighting. So.
Right. Okay, well, very good. Well, thanks a bunch, Brett. So, Kevin, we just heard a lot about some of the rules of the road impacting utilities. What are some of the things you guys are seeing on the technology side?
Very good, Donnie. Thank you. And Brett, nicely done. First, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Really what we look at is the change in the infrastructure and what's happening today when we consider what are, some of the, and when you look at it as a broad spectrum, this includes public safety, airlines and railroads, anybody that has command and control type infrastructure. What are the key underpinnings of the way that infrastructure is changing today? And for multiple reasons. One is mitigating risk, one is lowering costs, subsidizing or leveraging existing networks. Obviously, we have this huge transition to IP network infrastructure today, and how do we leverage that? Obviously for multiple reasons. Well, one of the key posts of that is decentralization, and the legacy systems and some of our traditional infrastructure. These systems tended to be focused in one location, put a lot of risk on a system. System failures would have a significant impact, and many of your standby systems were typically either cold or warm standby, which meant that somebody had to physically go move components, turn components on to do things a little bit differently. So in the decentralization world that evolved out of a distributed architecture, being able to leverage a network, you start seeing individual component impacts versus system-level impacts. You can also now start moving these devices out closer to what we call the edge of the network and putting them out either where the radio towers are or your PBX interfaces now also become very decentralized. You look at IP PBXs today, many of those are redundant and distributed, so you have call directors or session managers that allow you to control infrastructure from multiple locations in the event of loss. So it allows you multiple levels of redundancy and failover. So decentralization helps us improve and mitigate risk in the long term. Another component of that is looking at network-wide access. In legacy systems, you typically had to have two sets of infrastructure that had to be maintained. It was twice the work for the individuals maintaining the systems. Today, being more IP-centric, much like logging into your PC or logging onto a network through virtual machines, you're able to move around between command centers. In the event that you need to evacuate for some type of disaster, it is much easier to relocate yourself instead of your equipment, just pick up, log in somewhere else, and have that portability around the network. The other benefit is having this profile-based infrastructure allows you to log in and see the very resources that you need access to, and whether that's a public safety 911 center transitioning to a backup center or potentially having multiple centers that have to communicate at different times of day. Let's say that one county covers for another local administration during a specific period of time, you can now be able to access those resources leveraging that network. Again, just gives you a safety net to be able to communicate from different locations and not be stuck communicating from a single environment. Also, when you look at a key underpinning for the entire infrastructure is core now for redundancy and failover, right? So if you have a component that fails, in the legacy world, you would typically have a device that fails or a system that fails. You had to have a cold standby, hot standby, bring those things up. Today, you have this primary, secondary, or load shared environment where multiple devices can communicate and keep track of each other so that they have the ability to understand who's available and who's not available. And you can have multiple levels of failover based on either a local point of failure or a geodiverse point of failure, so that all these devices have the capability of communicating over the network and having different levels of granularity for redundancy and failover. It also allows you to have, in many of our utility environments that we work with today, we have both a distributed architecture as well as local autonomy. When we talk about local autonomy, we're talking about in an everything fails scenario, network infrastructure, loss of connectivity between distributed sites. Local autonomy allows us to have access at a local level so that we can communicate with local resources. So it gives us a last case resource to be able to communicate out of the local environment. And then lastly, looking at the flexibility of different communication tools that are out there today. When you consider the different radio technologies in the radio world, you've got P25, you've got different flavors of the FSI, the digital fixed station interface, the the console subsystem interface, the intersystem subsystem interface. So you've got different levels of varying protocols for, again, different, it's just one technology, P25 digital mobile radio. Then you start moving into the tier 2 and tier 3. Then you have some specialized radio technologies. Then you have control station radio technology. So there's this plethora of different technologies out there today. Some are standards-based, some are not. The ideal goal here is to be able to improve your long-term interoperability by having solutions that communicate on a standards-based infrastructure that allow you to be a little bit more portable between the technologies, because ultimately, as the end customer, you have the ability to be more in a competitive pricing environment as opposed to a proprietary environment. Everybody understands, when you're sole source, single vendor solution, you typically have the potential of being taken advantage of. Once you can put things out into an environment where you have the flexibility and the freedom of choice, you typically will become a much more competitive market driving your price. Ultimately, as you take all these technologies in, your ultimate goal in a command and control infrastructure is to be able to accommodate your current technologies, but also be somewhat future-proof or evergreen, allow you the opportunity to tie in new technologies as they evolve. We've all heard about LTE as a next-generation technology. What is that going to mean? There's still a lot of debate as to what LTE will ultimately become, but at the end of the day, it's a voice communication technology. So as you start looking at the various pieces that you plug into a network, into the infrastructure and architecture that you design for communications, you want to leave that door open to next-generation technologies. How do I integrate to those, and how much future flexibility will the system provide?
Good points, Kevin. Really good points. What are some of the, if I'm an entity, a utility, or someone else for that matter, and I'm looking to future-proof my command and control system, what are some of the questions I should ask a potential vendor to make sure I'm getting something that's not just going to work for me today, but going forward?
That's a good question, Donnie, and I think a lot of that goes back to, again, the use of open standards. How much do you utilize a standard-based infrastructure, whether that's the protocols that run on the network, whether that's a radio technology that uses a standards-based interface, whether that's the session initiation protocol that allows you to communicate with an IP PBX. All of those are based on standards, which allow you then to have the ability to move between different vendors and not have to be forced to a turnkey solution. In many ways, we talk about, certainly from our perspective, in a command and control of communications infrastructure is a console-first approach, where it allows you to make a choice about what the operator experience is going to look like, but then be able to tie in what your different technologies are and how they're going to communicate over time.
And I know there's a standard in P25 with CSSI with consoles. Are there standards, frankly, in non-P25 technologies to interface with consoles?
Absolutely. There are different varying technologies, whether it's the NXDN standard or the digital mobile radio Tier 2 or Tier 3 type standards as well. Again, there's a structure around them, and the DMR standard is very similar to the P25 standard, where there's a core set of features that are supported within the standard itself, and then it tends to be a little bit more of enhanced features tend to drift into the proprietary environment. But it's a matter of taking a look at the standard, what features you need to conduct business, and how they plug into and can be supported for the requirements of your specific business model.
Okay. Well, thanks a bunch, Kevin. Great information. So we're going to turn to Dave. We've heard a lot about utilities here. Tell us, how has the world of command and control evolved for hotels and casinos?
First of all, so most people don't realize that just along the Las Vegas Strip corridor, which is 4 miles, we have 15 of the 25 largest hotels in the world by room volume. So there's about 62,000 rooms just on that 4-mile stretch alone. So the way we maintain that in Las Vegas is obviously the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department can't do any of that by themselves. So we have a large security force and security and surveillance system in each resort. Each resort has 2 separate systems dedicated to surveillance. One is the security surveillance system, and then one is the surveillance system, the gaming surveillance system, which has access to all of security cameras as well as the gaming cameras as well. Nevada Gaming Control Board regulations, further regulations, we must monitor and record all live gaming. So when an incident occurs, we not only have the security surveillance systems to assist in tracking down, going eyes on any incident, but we also have our surveillance room who can break away some of their cameras and also assist in monitoring and tracking anything that's occurring. We work very closely with the Fusion Center here in Metro. They also have their own cameras on the Strip outside of the properties, and during certain events like New Year's or other major events during the year, we will actually put security officers at Metro headquarters in the Fusion Center so that we have real-time information and coming from inside the hotels as well as outside the hotels, and anticipation of anything that we're seeing or they're seeing, and we coordinate very well together. So the camera system, both inside the hotels and outside, is very intricate. A lot of people don't realize how many eyes we actually have on what's occurring 24/7, not just on the Strip, but in downtown as well. Our biggest concerns these days, aside from any type of terrorist attack or lone wolf attacks or active shooter, obviously, is cyber attacks. Most of the major resorts and corporations now have large cyber security components inside their IT systems and their IT groups. And most of our efforts are pointed towards point of sale areas, guest info areas such as registration and credit card areas. Obviously, we're PCI compliant, but the amount of hits that are coming in and the amount of attempted attacks sometimes can number in the thousands in one day. So that's kind of what we're doing in the Las Vegas resort arena.
Wow. So you mentioned you've got a lot of cameras, and I guess I'm wondering, just how many are we talking about? And do you primarily rely on humans to monitor all of this, or analytics, or some kind of combination?
Yeah, so I can't, just for security reasons, I can't give you the actual, but it's in the thousands at each resort. Okay. We cover inside, outside parking areas, perimeters, you name it, we've got a camera on it. The only thing we obviously can't monitor are the actual rooms themselves, but it's the human element pretty much. We have several individuals that just sit inside of our security room and monitor different areas of the hotel. When an incident is reported, then that's when we go live and either track the incident or monitor it as it's unfolding until we can get people boots on the ground, and of course even after.
Okay. And of the gear you use, how much of your stuff and interfaces and connectivity, how much of that is kind of standardized versus, proprietary solutions?
Most of it's standardized. We all work very well in the security industry together here. Obviously, we have to lean on each other. So there's not too many trade secrets or anything that's really proprietary. A lot of us use the same security and monitoring companies, the ones that are proven. And as far as the analytical stuff you were referencing, so we do have things such as license plate reader systems that are constantly monitoring, and they're very effective for return customers or return criminals, so to speak.
Right.
So we do use systems like that. What is not, we don't rely too much on analytical at this point. Even some of the facial recognition things that I've seen, some of the demonstrations I've seen, they just don't seem to be reliable enough for us to invest that kind of money yet. So mostly it's just human monitoring.
Okay. But are you all monitoring what's happening in those areas like facial recognition to see, when it's ready for prime time, for lack of a better term? Is that something you'd like to use?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I just, and I'm sure some people disagree with me, but we've done a lot of research in the last 2-3 years and looked at a lot of products, and I just, from our standpoint, it wouldn't be cost effective as a property for us to use it yet. I'm sure we'll get there, but we're just not confident yet that we'll get our bang for the buck.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Dave. Great information.
Thanks.
So, Walt, tell me, how has the world of command and control changed in the public safety realm?
It's changing a lot. In fact, I think in the public safety space, it's probably the area that IP and that type of transition has the most potential capability in terms of changing it. And it is, public safety community is a pretty conservative group of folks, though, and they really should be with the importance of what they're doing in mind. So it's not happening as rapidly as a lot of people would like it to, but nonetheless, it is really happening. In terms of where we're going with this and the benefits to the community, I think just like was mentioned earlier in the session, the reliability and the resilience and that type of thing when you're dealing with IP type infrastructure, a network can be built to be much more resilient and much more reliable as long as it's done properly in an IP world than it can with with a legacy and with a copper world. And I know that sounds kind of counter to what logically a lot of people think. But, if you look recently at some of the E911 failures and things like that, you've got a lot of single threads, a lot of paths that on the legacy technology that are relatively difficult to duplicate. And unfortunately, a lot of it's built on copper infrastructure, and unfortunately, the copper infrastructure is getting very old. It's aging. It's failing in some cases, and there's not a big incentive for the service providers to change it out because it's going to cost. It would cost a lot of money to do that. So transitioning over to IP and network-based services ends up making a lot of sense. What are some of the issues that you've got in the NG911 space and in the public safety space? And I'm going to divide it into two areas. One of them being NG911, which of course is looking at your emergency caller to the emergency call taker. So that's where the public actually comes into the public network. But then on the other side, once a call comes into the emergency call taker, more often than not, it's transferred over to the dispatcher, and dispatch then will go ahead and connect to the first responder. So, in that light there, what you've got basically is two sides of a network with NG911 on the left side, and then public safety broadband or FirstNet on the right side. And the interconnection of those two networks is primarily where we're doing the work, but also seeing the opportunities and challenges. But in 2004, the left side, the NG911 side, started the transition, and it's been ongoing ever since. The IP side of it, the public safety broadband, really started in about 2010, 2011, and then FirstNet was created in 2012. So that work is a little bit newer. Again, looking at some of the challenges that you've got in the public safety areas, the solutions are complex. If you look, for example, here at this is the NG911 architecture. This is, in essence, what holds all of the NG911 systems together. And there's a lot of, each one of those is a subsystem. There's a lot of functional elements that go into building a network. All of it there is IP-driven, and it's all based on standards, too. You're dealing with SIP signaling and HTTP communications throughout the process. So it is standards-based, which makes it easier and more cost-effective to implement, but there is still complexity to it. You look again at the public safety broadband and the LTE side, network's not quite, architecture is not quite as convoluted as it is in NG911 space, but there's still a lot of pretty complex functional elements that are built into an LTE network, regardless of whether it's public safety or whether it's carrier-based. So the challenges and issues we have are bridging the networks together. So especially in public safety, we've built a lot of silos over the years. And in one aspect, there's a common belief that FirstNet will be tearing down all the silos, and from the core infrastructure, they will be. But a lot of the stuff we're dealing with is applications and other networks that are out there, and especially when you get involved with a large disaster, a large crisis, typically there's a lot of mutual aid, a lot of support. So the various walled garden networks that are out there include things like the NG911 network, the FirstNet LTE network. The Department of Defense obviously has an internal network. FEMA has another internal network. Coast Guard, yet another network. The State National Guard units have their own network. And then you've got the international partners. In April, we're doing a project in Canada that involves border crossing, where part of the communications will be on the Canadian side, part of the operation will be on the U.S. side, and then how do you seamlessly talk across that? So it's building these bridges between the networks. Dave was talking a little bit earlier about the cameras in the hotels in Las Vegas. It would be great if if there is a active shooter in one of the hotels, it'd be wonderful if his video could actually be shared with the SWAT unit as it's rolling out to the site when it's needed. But you're not going to really give law enforcement access, obviously, to hotel cameras all the time. So you've got to really be able to build the bridges when you need them and then tear them down at all other times. So how do you do that? How do you put these networks together? When you're passing traffic from one network to another network, then you've got the other aspect of prioritization. One of the big things that LTE and other services, IP-based services, offer is that every network is going to get congested at some point. So how do I prioritize the critical traffic and push down some of the non-critical traffic? How do I create different queues? And since the underlying infrastructure can do that, you want to be able to take advantage of it. And again, that's one of the big marketing points, one of the big sales points of the FirstNet network over the carriers' networks, is the ability and desire to be able to prioritize. But in order to do that, you've got to be able to take the traffic and mark it across boundaries. So again, as I'm going over here, looking again at the NG911 solution, a call comes into from the emergency caller to the emergency call taker, and as that call is transferred over to dispatch, it really needs to be prioritized over on the NG911 side, because it could be a emergency call taker calling a first responder with critical video or critical telemetry information, or it might just be someone calling a friend for lunch. So you need to be able to figure out what traffic is important, so that if we do have congestion, we have the ability to prioritize. So that type of thing is really is one of the big benefits. And then we also need to be able to do application testing on the network in a way that we can test new applications on the network without threatening existing law enforcement networks. The carriers have all built, the service providers have all built those types of facilities and those types of capabilities. That's something that we'll have to have in the public safety space as well. That's really not there at this point. Then you have kind of the concept of federated authentication. The idea, again, is if you look at the Bastrop fires a number of years ago in Texas, we had first responders from all 50 states, firemen from all 50 states, assisting us with putting out the fire. When they get here, they need to be able to get access to our applications without us creating a user ID and password for every user on every application. You know, if you look at apps on like smartphones and things like that, that's the type of thing you have now, is every time you get a new app, you have to have a new set of credentials. That doesn't lend itself for emergency response, fast response, where I've got people coming in, and again, looking at, at Dave's cameras, I want to get somebody in there that needs to have access, but again, we don't really want, it wouldn't work very well if the casino had to create a user ID and password on the fly. So how do we get past that? And then overarching on absolutely everything is the security aspect. Going to an IP-based network, you're putting a lot of eggs in one basket, and it is really critical and important to make sure that that basket is very, very, very well protected, because this was also mentioned earlier, there are bad guys out there, bad guys and gals out there that are trying to get into the network all the time. Fortunately, when you look at things like the DoD networks and you look at things like the public safety broadband networks, there are pretty hardened firewalls that are built between the public safety networks and the commodity internet. So that managing those and maintaining those has to be first and foremost.
No, absolutely. Well, one of the things that has come up with both NextGen 911 and FirstNet, in terms of the personnel that you're going to need going forward, how do you see that changing in an all IP environment versus what we have today?
I think overall, if you look at the first responders and if you look at the dispatchers and stuff like that, the end users will be a lot more able to embrace the technology and utilize the technology than you might imagine. You know, we did, for example, we were testing some situational awareness tools on LTE network up on the Canadian border last year. And, quite frankly, the training period really wasn't that long to get the deputy sheriff up in Havre, Montana, to be able to use the app, because they've been using smartphones and using apps in their personal life, non-business life, for quite a while. So that part of it's not that difficult. The larger part of it really is all of the technology support that needs to be behind it. And that's kind of why I showed the slide there on the NG 911 system. In E911, in essence, you can contact the telephone company and say, hey, I want to put up a PSAP, and somebody will come in and install the terminals, and they'll put in a T1 line, and all this routing and all this processing and everything else happens behind the curtains in the telephone company's network. That isn't necessarily the case when we transition to IP-based public safety networks. Somebody's going to have to monitor this stuff, somebody's going to have to manage it, somebody's going to have to configure it, and there's going to be a large requirement for staffing augmentation in that space.
And I would assume that you're going to need some different, I know there are a lot of different approaches to doing this, but suddenly you're going from an all-voice situation in PSAPs to, hey, some voice and text right now, and more text coming forward. But eventually when we get to video, you have a whole different set of skill set, don't you, to both digest the video and repackage it so it can be sent out in a usable way to the field, right?
Well, even simple things like, for example, text messaging, existing provisions with PSAPs, kind of rule that you don't start another 911 call until you've completely processed the last call. You really only are involved in one incident at a time. That's great for a phone call that's circuit switched where you actually are establishing a connection. Text messaging really doesn't establish a connection. So I may get a text message from a person in distress now. I might not get another text message for 10 minutes. So does that mean that you don't do anything until you hear the last message, and you don't know when the last message is? So a lot of the provisions and a lot of the rules and a lot of the guidelines we have set up right now will end up changing. But again, I think they're going to change in a much more positive direction, because in essence really what we're doing, especially with the first responders, is we're giving them unbelievable capabilities that they do not have today. And that kind of, and that's why I was kind of saying it's not as difficult for the end user, because with most people, if you put tools in their hands, they figure out quickly how to use them.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So Dave, you guys have already gone through this transition, I assume, at hotels and casinos. What kind of changes did you see in terms of finding people and creating operations to deal with the introduction of things like data and video into your command and control operations?
One way is to offer competitive rates, quite frankly. So we pull from a lot of retired law enforcement folks that were involved with federal agencies that were experts in their field, and that's our biggest draw. Obviously, there's a lot in the private industry as well, but for our venue and the security and surveillance portion, it's tantamount for us to have a lot of that law enforcement experience. So we have a lot of folks from local agencies as well as several from federal agencies that specialized in the technical field, before coming to the corporate side.
Okay, and you've been doing this for a while. How has the command and control center that you have there, how has that changed over the last few years? I mean, I assume it's bigger, or is it have you just shuffled things around and the gear itself has become smaller, and you're still able to, have, as you were saying, thousands of cameras in place and monitored?
Yeah. So we've the resorts themselves and the corporations that run them have realized how integral it is to have a large surveillance and security system, so a monitoring system. So the rooms have grown. The money has been laid out to make sure we have the best technology available. We've gone from, in most instances, we've gone from 4 or 5 screens or monitors to, in some cases, 35 to 40 in one room, and then added, obviously, the human component. There might be as many as 15 to 20 on a shift now, working one room, one monitoring room, where probably 10 years ago there might have been 4 or 5. So the importance of it has not been lost on the corporations and the folks that own the hotels and the resorts.
Okay, all right. Very good. So I want to encourage everyone. We still have about 15 minutes for this webinar. Please send in your questions, and a few of you have, and we'll be addressing those as quickly as possible. One question, Kevin, a little bit about local autonomy. Can you explain what that means in the context of distributed command center design?
Sure, Donnie, thank you. It's a good question. Typically, when we talk about local autonomy, it's really about looking at a worst-case scenario. If I lose connectivity, if I lose all the infrastructure in a distributed design, how do I manage that loss? Ultimately, how am I going to be able to communicate? So typically, we look at varying levels of granularity for failure, starting from the highest level of maybe potential I lose a component, and then we start breaking that down until where I have to become a standalone entity. So I need to have a predefined set of interfaces and resources available to me in my local environment when I no longer am able to communicate outside. So it's being able to have that fallback plan as a worst-case scenario and breaking it down to its least common denominator. These are the critical components that I need to have available to me. So how do I design my system around that design?
All right. Very good. Well, another question from the audience. Regarding P25, question regarding P25 standard for LMR. Despite the fact that P25 standard was supposed to foster competition, I've heard that radios are more expensive. I guess the question I would have is, are you all seeing, what are you seeing in terms of price of the P25 standard, and how does that impact command and control? And also, Kevin, for you in particular, and for you, Walt, are you all seeing adoption of some of these interface standards like CSSI and ISSI?
Yeah, we definitely are. For example, we did a large, working with one of the radio manufacturers, we did a large ISSI project, I guess it's been a year or two now, that involved taking the P25 networks for Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi and setting it up to where you could basically talk across the entire region with other public safety folks. Now, again, that was driven by the BP leak. So, you had responders working in all three states together, and it was important that communications really ended up working. That's the largest. If you go to an after action report with most any major incident anywhere, and the public safety is real good about writing up after a major incident what went right and what went wrong. Almost every case, communications is the biggest, first, most noted issue when you're dealing with multi responder type organizations, because again, we bring out the National Guard, they bring in the military units and all of the the green camo trucks and trailers and stuff like that, and the soldiers can't talk to the civilian police officers because the systems don't communicate. So, those standards, those interoperability standards, are real important. We did a project last fall that involved the DoD here at the test facility, and we quickly did a bridge. We were able to bridge the voice communications between the DoD network and the civilian networks, primarily because of the fact that they both are using SIP standards. So they're both working at least on a platform that is standards-based. So when we do need to bridge the two, it's pretty viable. In fact, we did it within a few hours.
Okay, wow, interesting. So, Kevin, what are your thoughts on the P25 standard, and is it more expensive? Is it a better deal, and how are some of these standardized interfaces working in the utility world?
Yeah, I would say, Donnie, I think price is relative, right? So it's what you get, the bang for the buck. When you look at the P25 standard, the common air interface, especially in public safety, which is where the dominant P25 market exists today, more so than utilities. And reason being is because of that famous word of interoperability, and that is having a network that has police, fire, the dog catcher, the trash collector. When you look at an overall encompassing network that has to accommodate multiple agencies, the level of play for interoperability is much greater than it would be in a utility environment where you have basically a controlled, let's call it a controlled environment that doesn't have a need for as much interoperability between different agencies, where they tend to be a little bit more focused on a job-related or specific communications need. So I think that's where you see a lot of the difference between the demand for P25 open standards. But when you carry that across all command infrastructure, whether it's transportation for airlines and railroads, public safety, or utilities, it really comes down to the open level of competition, and radio costs have gone down significantly on the P25 side because you have an open standard common interface. You can buy different radios from different individuals at varying levels of capability. And that's really where the value of open standards comes into play, is again, creates that free market concept, let you buy what you need to fit. And in many of the dispatch centers that we've participated in that are using the P25 standard or are using a DMR standard, the end customer actually has the opportunity to look at multiple solutions and pick what's best for their environment, as opposed to being sold a complete turnkey solution that says, well, this is what you get because this is what you chose to buy. So there's a lot of value just beyond cost. It really comes down to how does it best suit your business.
Okay, all right. Brett, you mentioned that, with the retirement of some of the analog legacy technologies and things like that, just wanted to clarify, in terms of, is the utility industry, are they comfortable with the notion of, be it fiber or, an LTE or something like that, being able to functionally do it? Or is it just a matter of we need it to do our function at the same price as the older stuff, and so that all of our cost considerations stay in place?
Yeah, there's nothing inherently wrong with using fiber or IP. It's just how it's configured. And so, utility companies can use fiber, and they do for mission-critical applications. It's just that, on the carrier networks, a lot of times they don't support the kind of latency the utility companies need. And similarly, when it comes to reliability, the utility networks have a lot of backup power relatively compared to the carrier networks.
Okay. And I guess that brings up the question I always end up asking you is, any word on possibly doing some kind of a sharing with FirstNet or anything like that? Any new words?
We're continuing to engage with FirstNet. Utility companies are interested in it. I guess the biggest question that utilities have is, priority access during emergencies. To what extent that the functional requirements are going to be able to continue to be met during those times when there's potential for preemption, for example. And then secondly, just how fast the network's going to be built out. So utility companies have near-term needs. The sooner the better in terms of the broadband network. So we definitely want to partner with FirstNet.
Okay. And from a utility standpoint, would it be problematic if, hey, I build FirstNet and I even build it in your territory, but I may not build it in your entire territory? I might build it in one state and you may cover two. And does that create operational difficulties if it's not consistent all the way through?
Well, that is another concern, to what extent this network gets built out into rural areas where a lot of utilities have infrastructure that requires, reliable communications. Yeah, that's another concern that we have. Right now, it seems like the focus is going to be on those urban areas and less on the rural areas.
All right.
Yeah, but Donnie, I think you need to remember though too that inequity and that disparity between the various areas really exists very much so in our existing networks today. We've got, you go into Houston or Dallas or New York, you've got probably 5, 6, 7, 8 broadband service providers that can provide network access. You get into Beedi, Texas, and you're often doing pretty good to find one.
Very, very good point. And Brett, just to clarify, in terms of what utilities are looking for, they're not necessarily looking for everything that they do to be prioritized all the time, but just some very core elements, correct?
That's right. So those mission-critical applications, the ones that will actually ensure safety and reliability, operational security, those are the ones that utility companies need to have priority access, and they actually represent a relatively small amount of the overall bandwidth required by utilities.
Okay, all right. Good points. I have a question from the audience about redundancy and backup of command and control centers. I guess it's an age-old question. How do you get over the desire to maintain independence? Walt, I know you've wrestled with this, but I'd love to hear what other folks think as well.
If I understand the question correctly, I mean the redundancy and resilience and everything else. If you look at the whole NG911 architecture, there's even processes built in, like for example the ESRP, the Emergency Services Routing Proxy, that really is designed to be able to take, in New Orleans. The PSAPs were having staffing issues because obviously people are having a hard time to getting to work or couldn't get to work. So in essence, how do I route that traffic quickly and fairly automatically to another center when I really need to? That kind of thing is actually pretty easy to do in an IP world. It's somewhere between difficult and impossible to do in an SS7 world. You don't suddenly take a lot of SS7 traffic going into New Orleans and suddenly send it up to Dallas or Houston. And we often do a lot of our backup arrangements and everything else with close partners that are local, that are close by. But New Orleans is going to have dozens, if not hundreds, of call takers at any one given point in time, the same as Dallas or Houston. So Dallas or Houston could act as a backup. You're not going to be able to take backup New Orleans off of a 3-position PSAP in one of the other parishes in New Orleans, in Louisiana. So, in essence, how do I get stuff somewhere else quickly? IP's got to beat hands down on that every single time.
Okay. All right. Another question that keeps coming up is the Internet of Things. As a concept, you have sensors everywhere. All this information can be flowing in all over IP, and that sounds great. I guess, how do you all see the Internet of Things changing the way how command and control works in your sector? And then secondly, what are your cybersecurity concerns associated with all of these things being connected, and probably there's almost no way to monitor what security is actually on those, and can they serve as backdoors for hackers? Dave, you mentioned you all get a lot of attacks. Do you see the Internet of Things changing things at all, better or worse?
No, I see it changing for the better. I mean, we're constantly evolving. It's taken such a priority in this industry because of the chance of us getting completely shut down, number one, or being compromised to where our internet services are down, any of our surveillance systems are down. I mean, if somebody were able to shut those down, the manpower necessary to secure our hotel and our property and our gaming is, we'd be calling people in 24 hours a day. So when I tell you that cybersecurity is on the forefront of everybody's minds, and they've invested a lot of time and effort into making sure that we are secure in that arena, I can tell you it's all the hotels in Las Vegas talk and have meetings constantly and exchange ideas and products and listen to vendors, and it's probably, if not our top priority, within the top 2 because of the proclivity of folks being able to come in and either shut us down or compromise any of our systems, I would say that's only in the last 4 or 5 years that we've really gone headstrong into this arena.
Okay, all right.
Donnie, too, from the public safety side, it's we're building all of the public safety networks to be able to support the IoT concept. Right now in the 911 world, though, there is a pretty strong policy that they will not have 911 calls come in directly from a non-person. So in other words, the concept of your fire alarm panel actually initiating a 911 call is something people talk about, but the industry has to turn around quite a bit to do that. From a security aspect of it, though, it's almost a little bit scary because you will have companies that will provide high-quality, well-engineered, well-designed products that will be sold at higher cost, and unfortunately, you're also going to have, especially for the residential market, you're going to have lower-cost devices that are going to be pretty inexpensive, but probably don't spend as much time on the security. And having those devices in houses and residents all over the country, and then possibly being able to be hacked. When you also have to keep in mind that most people that sell network appliances for the residential market generally turn off a lot of the security aspects of it because it complicates the installation. They really want you to be able to get it home, plug it in, turn it on. That almost by necessity, if you look at it, for example, even on home wireless routers and stuff like that, they always set a default user ID and password that unfortunately a lot of people don't change. And if they're not changed, things like that are going to be potential backdoors and then bring up the exact issue that you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know what was it, kids' toys and stuff were have just been in the news here the last week of, things that are creating data breaches and things like that. Kevin, from and Brett as well, if you want, utilities, these kind of breaches and security issues, it's rough on a hotel certainly, and it's rough on public safety. But boy, the idea of, hey, can somebody break in and turn all the power off and things like that is awfully scary. I guess, what do you see happening in the utility realm to help prevent those kind of attacks?
Yeah, Donnie, I think that's the flavor of the month for the utility industry, right? Security has become one of the probably the highest level of concerns for grid protection and grid control, to the point where you're talking about not only internet access or internet hacking and taking over control remotely, but it's shutting down, obviously all of your computers, but it also goes to the human level of anti-tamper and protecting, the assets you have internally, because not all threats and many significant threats don't only just come from the outside, they also come from the inside. So it's also being able to control the environment internally. So from a utility perspective, this has become one of their highest priorities now, is not only protection of the assets from internal or external threats, but it's also now looking at how do they protect against internal threats at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. Kevin's point about people is as much about peoples and processes as it is about technology. So we want to say, think about a single silver bullet, but really, a lot of times the vulnerabilities are related back to failures of the process or, human error. So we're trying to educate our members about that, find them tools to try and improve the process for cybersecurity. And just, to drive home this point, I mean, utility companies are subject to mandatory reliability standards, including cybersecurity. So there's a lot at stake, not just in terms of the power going out. That's certainly the number one concern for utility companies, but there are also some very, very significant fines for these kind of events taking place. So, rest assured, utility companies are devoting every effort towards improving cybersecurity.
Well, it's a fascinating thing because everything seems to be moving so quickly, and that seems to be the one bump in the road, and it's great to hear that people are looking at it so hard and trying to address it. We have another question from the audience. Do I introduce security risk into my LMR when moving from T1 to IP?
Again, Donnie, back to kind of my previous answer, yes and no. If you do it properly, for example, we just transitioned our P25 network over from T1 to IP-based. But again, what we did is we used IPsec tunnels to connect the devices and then also put access control lists on the routers that say this here is a P25 router, this is a P25 router. These two devices are allowed to talk to each other, but they're the only devices they are allowed to talk to. That way, everybody else in the world won't even be able to see them. So there are ways of protecting it, but again, you really need to work closely with your network infrastructure people that understand network security to be able to do it properly. And actually, if you do it that way, it's just as secure.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, Donnie, it's Kevin. I was just going to say there's one other thing you see a lot of, and that is separation of data versus voice. In many instances, what's being considered critical voice is being separated from internal corporate infrastructure, isolating those points of vulnerability, no internet access, no, as Walter said, no other devices that can communicate on that network with that infrastructure. It sounds somewhat limiting, but when you do tunnels or you do create virtual LANs to isolate that infrastructure, you can introduce a level of security that is not leveraging or utilizing the same communication infrastructure as your internal corporate data networks.
Okay. All right, very good. And for our last question of the day, talk a little bit about the age-old issue of funding. This frankly goes across, all the segments that we're talking about here. Is, you've got, in many cases, analog. You're moving from, this legacy technology to the newer IP technology. You've got to maintain the ability to communicate with the legacy system while you're making this transition, and it doesn't happen all in a day. How do you fund both sides of the equation, so to speak? Dave, you may have already done this pretty much in at the Cosmopolitan already, but and in the hotel industry, but particularly for utilities and public safety, where does the money come from to move forward as well as keep things going today? Dave, first off, are you all, in your mind, do you all feel like you all have completed the transition, or are you still in the process?
No, we're still in the process. We had new owners come in December. That was before I started here. I'm lucky. The money's there. I can tell you that typically in capital expenditures in the past, in the corporate world, IT-related issues and communication issues were lower on the totem pole. Since I've been here, I would wager to say 75% of our capital expenditures are concentrated on those very issues, which is refreshing for me, because coming from the public safety world, it was exactly like you described, as okay, we want to do this, but where's the money going to come from? Where here, they're taking it extremely serious, and the money's available, thank goodness for us. So, it's kind of, like I said, after fighting those battles for so many years, it's refreshing to be on this end of it for once.
Okay. Brett, Kevin, what are you all seeing in utilities? Are they having funding issues as they're making this transition?
It's an ongoing process. The utility companies have embraced IT. It's just a question of sheer number of circuits and having to convert a lot of those things to IT. And then you've got some legacy systems out there that need to have bridging technologies at least to be able to communicate with the new IP systems.
Are state commissions saying, yes, but you can build that into the rate base to make this transition, or are they getting any pushback on that?
No, that, to my knowledge, has not been an issue. I think state regulators fully understand that this is all part of maintaining reliability and modernizing utility networks. So They have not gotten into that level of detail in terms of the IPA part of it.
Okay.
Yeah, Donnie, I think one of the key differences between the public safety environment, where many times capital expenditure is a difficult process, where public safety is very dependent on taxpayer dollar or grant funding from the state and federal governments. On the utility side, typically being many of them either cooperatives or independently owned utilities, they have inherent and ever-going infrastructure improvement budgets that, because they have to maintain such an overall and expansive network of cabling, of towers, et cetera, all that infrastructure that has to be supported, they typically do have dollars built into their budgets. And fortunately, the communications environment is a necessary component of maintaining that infrastructure. So as they migrate through technologies, we've certainly seen a mass migration coming off of legacy-based PBXs. We've seen the migration from analog radio infrastructure over to IP-based infrastructure. Obviously, utilities have a much greater reach when it comes to deploying data infrastructure out to tower locations. So there's some advantages on both sides because utilities tend to have that capital budget available for network and infrastructure improvement. It tends to be somewhat easier for them to fund that type of implementation and improvement.
Okay. So, Walt, everyone seems to agree public safety's got it toughest. You've got the FirstNet situation, and most people believe FirstNet's underfunded, but it's got they've got an interesting approach, and I guess we'll find out in a year or so, whether that worked on that side. But on the next generation 911 side, where does the money come from? And when, frankly, a lot of 911 centers are having enough trouble, keeping things going with the legacy stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nani, because and that's the issue that really most of the state organizations are having to fight right now in the NG 911 transition. I would say it's we have there is an ongoing fee that everyone pays for 911 services, either with a landline or a cell phone. So there's a steady revenue stream coming in, and it's designed really to keep things working in an operational state, in a static state. The reality, though, is as you're going from E911 to NG911, unfortunately, you've got to run both networks at least for a certain period of time until you've completed the transition. And during that transition, you're even going to have a higher operational cost, not to mention the capital costs. So, the states are battling that right now. It just has to move higher up on the stack in terms of state priorities to get it to go there. What we are seeing right now, though, is a lot of the legacy equipment is going away, and we've got some systems. We've got some systems out there that are only supportable through. When your source of spare parts becomes eBay, you've got a problem. So so it's a lot of the legacy stuff is at end of life or past end of life. So increasing the priority of getting those transitions funded it's a challenge, but it's getting a lot of attention.
Well, and it's got to be an issue from a personnel standpoint too, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of hard to find people. Don't go to school to study some of the older analog technologies. They all are doing IT related stuff, right?
Well, and and unfortunately too, especially when you're dealing with there is a significant, looking at IT security, there's a significant shortfall nationwide of IP or IT security experts. And Dave's mentioning the fact earlier that they have a large security IT staff on board. The unfortunate reality is that states and local governments, we don't pay our IT security experts, or we can't pay our IT security experts as much as industry and things like the casinos can. So unfortunately, when there is a shortage of those kind of folks, and we're at the mid to the lower part of the pay scale, we feel the shortage is worse than other folks.
Okay. And do you think you might be seeing things like, I think FCC Chairman Wheeler mentioned the idea of regional, security centers and things like that to service, all the PSAPs in a given area or something. Do you think that can work, or is it that people really want to have that person in their building?
I think they'd like to have that person in their building, but if that's not a viable option, I think we could make shared service. We will make shared services work.
Okay. Wow. Well, great stuff, and thank you. And we are at the end of our webinar here today. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank our panelists, terrific panel today, Brett Kilburn, Kevin Sumrell, Dave Logue, and Walt Magnuson for their participation in today's event. Excellent job, all of you, and want to thank Avtec, our sponsor, for making this session possible. And I want to thank everyone in our audience for attending today and for a lot of great questions. Thank you, and have a productive remainder of your day.